January 1973. A cold, desperate wind whistled through the vents of the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Deep in the basement, away from the prying eyes of Congress, a silent decision had just been signed into law. The order was simple and terrifying. Burn everything. For 3 days and 3 nights, the incinerators of the CIA ran at white-hot temperatures. They weren't just burning paper. They were erasing 20 years of human screams and broken souls. This was the end of Project MKUltra, a secret operation so dark, so violation of every human law, that the director of the CIA risked his career to ensure the world would never see the files. But why? What was inside those folders that was more dangerous than a nuclear bomb? Was it the evidence of children being used as lab rats? Or perhaps the blueprint for a science that could literally delete a person's soul? The High Command told us the files were gone, but they forgot one thing. The archives never truly burn. Welcome to Silent War Archives. Today, we step into the smoke to uncover the forbidden truth of the CIA's mind control experiments. We have spent years digging through the redacted debris, interviewing the survivors who were left as ghosts in the system, and analyzing the fragments that survived the fire. Prepare yourself, because once we pull back this curtain, the concept of free will might never feel the same again. You are about to enter the most suppressed archive in history. This is the story of the files they tried to bury and the darkness they couldn't kill. To the neighbors in Virginia, he was just a quiet goat farmer, a man who lived off the land, who milked his own goats and practiced meditation. But every morning, this gentle farmer would put on a suit and drive to a secret laboratory where he would transform into the CIA's most dangerous asset. His name was Sidney Gottlieb. He wasn't just a chemist. He was the high priest of this silent decision. He believed that the human mind was like a safe, and if you used enough chemicals, enough electricity, and enough pain, you could eventually crack the code. In 1951, Gottlieb was given control of the TSS, the Technical Services Staff. This wasn't a standard government department. It was a factory of forbidden science, with a multi-million-dollar black budget that required no receipts. He began to build his team of silent specialists, doctors, psychiatrists, and chemists who had no interest in healing, only in destruction. Gottlieb told them that the Cold War wasn't being fought with bombs, but with consciousness. If the Soviets could brainwash a man, the United States had to learn how to unmake a man first. The laboratory doors were locked, and the ethics of the modern world were left outside. Gottlieb's first obsession was the truth serum. He scoured the archives of Nazi scientists, specifically those from the Dachau concentration camp, to see how they used mescaline to break prisoners. He wanted a drug that would strip away a person's will, making them a biological tape recorder. He began experimenting with anything he could find: heroin, morphine, and eventually a new, mysterious substance called LSD. He didn't just want to know how it felt. He wanted to know if it could erase a memory. This silent decision was to turn American cities into open-air laboratories without ever telling the subjects they were part of the game. The first drop of blood on Gottlieb's hands was one of his own. In November 1953, at a secret retreat in Deep Creek Lake, he spiked the drinks of his fellow scientists with LSD. One of them, Dr. Frank Olson, plunged into a terrifying paranoia. A week later, Olson fell from a 10th-story window in New York City. The CIA called it a suicide due to job stress, but the archives tell a different story. Gottlieb was the one who signed the silent order to monitor Olson until his elimination. This was the moment the world should have seen the smoke, but the fire was hidden beneath layers of redacted files and official denials. In San Francisco, Gottlieb set up a safe house that was more like a house of horrors. He called it Operation Midnight Climax. CIA operatives would lure men into a bedroom, were behind a one-way mirror. Gottlieb and his specialists would watch while sipping martinis. They would observe the effects of massive doses of drugs on unsuspecting citizens, recording every scream, every hallucination, and every mental breakdown. This was the ultimate silent decision. To Gottlieb, these people weren't citizens, they were disposable assets. The archives of these nights were filled with recordings that no human being was ever meant to hear. But San Francisco was only the tip of the iceberg. Deep beneath the ground at Fort Detrick, Gottlieb built the most forbidden rooms in the world. These were the sublevels of the poisoner. Here, he developed toxins that didn't just kill, they humiliated. Biological weapons for world leaders, a poisoned cigar for Castro, a toxic handkerchief for a Congolese prime minister. The air in these sublevels was thick with the scent of chemicals and the vibration of high-frequency acoustic drills. He wanted a way to command a person's brain via radio waves. The silent decision was to turn the human anatomy into a puppet, and Gottlieb was the one pulling the strings. Gottlieb soon realized that drugs were only half the battle. To truly unmake a mind, you needed trauma. In secret facilities in Canada and Germany, MKUltra patients were subjected to sensory deprivation for weeks at a time. They were forced into chemically induced sleeps that lasted for months, while headphones played repetitive messages into their brains. One survivor reported waking up in a room where the walls were covered in her own handwriting, yet she had no memory of writing a single word. Gottlieb called this de-patterning. We call it the systematic destruction of a human soul. The silent decision to use trauma as a surgical tool is a debt that history still cannot repay. How did he sleep at night? Gottlieb justified every atrocity as a necessary evil for national security. He viewed his victims not as people, but as data points in an interdimensional war. He possessed a level of narcissism that allowed him to play God in the morning and go home to his goats in the evening without a flicker of remorse. He was a man who lived in the gilded age of secrecy, where a lab coat was a license to kill. The archives of his mind were a labyrinth of cold logic and a chilling belief that the individual must always be sacrificed for the state. In 1973, when the heat of investigation began to rise, it was Gottlieb who signed the final silent decision. He knew that if the public ever saw the MKUltra Files, the CIA would be dismantled. He ordered the immediate destruction of over 80% of the project's documentation. He watched as the archives of 20 years of torture turned into gray ash. He believed he had won, that the silence would protect him, and for decades, it did. But he forgot that the survivors, the ghosts of his experiments, they carry the archives in their blood, and blood, unlike paper, cannot be burned. Sidney Gottlieb died in 1999, in his own bed, surrounded by his goats and his secrets. He never faced a judge. He never spent a day in prison. He died as a ghost in the machine, a man who had successfully erased himself from the very history he had helped to write. But as we move deeper into this silent war archives, we realize that the poisoner is still with us. He is in the static of our radios and in the shadows of our modern medicine. The archive is open, and the wizard's mask is finally being pulled away. Prepare yourself, for the next chapter is where the mind control becomes physical. By 1953, Sidney Gottlieb realized that the white-tiled laboratories of the CIA were too small for his ambition. He needed a field of operation that was vast, unpredictable, and completely unaware of his presence. The silent decision was made to turn the entire North American continent into a petri dish. He didn't want professional volunteers. He wanted Maryuta, human logs who were too vulnerable to fight back. Prisoners, mental patients, and the poor. They became the first targets of a chemical war that was fought in the shadows of our own streets. The methods were as terrifying as they were simple. CIA operatives would walk into crowded bars and spike the drinks of random citizens with massive doses of LSD. They would then follow the victims home, watching from the bushes as their reality began to melt. Imagine sitting in a quiet park, and suddenly, the trees begin to breathe, the ground turns into liquid, and you have no idea that your own government is the one pulling the trigger. Gottlieb watched it all, recording this psychological breakdown with the cold efficiency of a butcher. In San Francisco, Gottlieb created the House of Glass. Under the code name Operation Midnight Climax, he hired women to lure men into CIA-funded safe houses. But these weren't homes, they were traps. Behind every painting, behind every mirror, were hidden microphones and one-way viewing portals. As the drugs took hold, the victims would lose their minds in a storm of hallucinations. Gottlieb would sit in the next room, behind the glass, observing the absolute destruction of a man's dignity for the sake of national security. The archives of these safe houses are a testament to the death of human rights. But the most brutal experiments happen behind prison walls. In a Kentucky penitentiary, 7 black prisoners were given LSD every single day for 77 days straight. This wasn't testing. It was an attempt to delete the human consciousness. Gottlieb wanted to see if he could create a permanent break in reality, a mind that was so shattered, it could be completely rewritten. The men were left in padded cells, their screams echoing through the corridors for months. By the time it was over, they weren't men anymore. They were biological hardware for the silent war. Gottlieb soon moved into deep sleep therapy. Patients at the Allen Memorial Institute were put into chemically induced comas that lasted for months. While they were unconscious, Gottlieb's specialists played repetitive messages on a loop into their ears for 20 hours a day. You are no longer Elias Thorne. You are a subject of the state. They called it depatterning. They were trying to scrub the brain like a dirty chalkboard. The silent decision was to turn these innocent people into ghosts, men and women who would wake up and not even remember their own mothers. When drugs failed, Gottlieb used the void. Sensory deprivation tanks were built in secret sublevels. Subjects were placed in total darkness, in salt-saturated water, 4 days at a time, without light, without sound, and without human contact. The mind begins to eat itself. They reported seeing entities from other dimensions, hearing voices that didn't belong to this world. Gottlieb recorded it all, believing he had found a way to bridge the gap between our reality and the abyss. The archives of these void sessions were so terrifying that even the guards refused to read them. The ultimate goal was to turn the human mind into a biological tape recorder. Gottlieb believed that if you shattered a person's will with LSD, you could implant a silent command that would lay dormant for years. A sleeper agent who would wake up at the sound of a specific word, perform an assassination, and then forget everything. He called it the Manchurian Candidate Protocol. The silent decision to create human weapons was signed off by the highest levels of the CIA, turning modern science into a factory for murderers. In Montreal, Dr. Ewan Cameron, funded by Gottlieb's black budget, took the horror to its peak. He subjected patients to high-voltage electroshock therapy, 30 times the standard dose. He would repeat the process until the patients were reduced to a vegetative state, and then he would begin the re-education. Families who sent their loved ones for simple depression received back broken shells who couldn't even feed themselves. The silent decision to hide this massacre lasted for 40 years. The Archive of Montreal is a cemetery of shattered souls. The fallout of these experiments was a generation of chemical ghosts. Thousands of Americans and Canadians wandered the streets with permanent brain damage, convinced that the voices in their heads were their own. They were told they were crazy. They were told they were sick, while the CIA specialists were being promoted for their scientific breakthroughs. The silent decision was to treat the victims as externalities, mere trash from the wheels of progress. But the static in the radio, the shadows in the hallway, they are the echoes of what was stolen from these people. As the experiments of Section 3 reached their peak, Gottlieb knew he had achieved the impossible. He had found a way to unmake the human identity. But the data he collected, it wasn't for science. It was for the hive. He was preparing the world for a future where nobody owns their own thoughts. The archives were being sealed, the fires were being prepped, and the poisoner was already looking for his next victim. Prepare yourself, for in the next chapter, we go down to Sublevel 7, where the experiments became physical. If the streets were the laboratory, then Sublevel 7 was the incinerator, hidden beneath the concrete foundation of a decommissioned military hospital. This floor did not officially exist. It was here that Gottlieb moved his incurables, subjects whose minds were already too broken for the surface world. He built vertical isolation tubes, narrow concrete cylinders where a person would be suspended in total darkness for weeks. No sound, no light, no human touch. Only the rhythmic dripping of water to mark the passing of time. The silent decision was to see how fast the human brain would begin to eat itself in the absence of reality. By the late 1950s, drugs were no longer enough for the poisoner. He wanted direct access to the brain. In the operating rooms of Sublevel 7, specialists performed crude surgeries, implanting hair-thin electrodes directly into the hypothalamus. They wanted to find the button for fear and the button for obedience. Using high-frequency radio waves, they would trigger intense bursts of rage or pleasure in subjects who were strapped into metal chairs. The archives of these remote control trials describe men and women acting like puppets, their every emotion controlled by a dial in the next room. Gottlieb called it RHIC, Radio Hypnotic Intercontinental Control. The goal was to create a human being who could be activated from thousands of miles away. They would put subjects into a deep hypnotic trance, and then play a specific frequency into their ears. When you hear the tone, you will perform the task, and then you will forget. They were trying to build a silent army of assassins who didn't even know they were killers. The silent decision to weaponize the human subconscious turned the citizens of the free world into potential disposable assets for the CIA. The acoustics of Sublevel 7 were designed for madness. Gottlieb's engineers developed sonic chambers, where high-frequency sounds were played at the edge of human hearing. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like a needle scratching the inside of your skull. Subjects reported the feeling of their internal organs vibrating, and their thoughts being replaced by a chaotic white noise. Some would claw at their own ears until they bled, just to stop the sound. The silent decision was to see if sound could be used to erase an entire personality, leaving only a blank slate for the state to rewrite. But the horror went deeper than sound and drugs. In a hidden wing of the sublevel, Gottlieb partnered with the Atomic Energy Commission. They injected unsuspecting patients with radioactive plutonium and uranium, just to observe how long the human body could survive a nuclear poisoning. These people were told they were receiving vitamins, but in reality, they were being turned into biological Geiger counters. The silent decision to use radiation as a mind control tool is one of the most redacted chapters of the MKUltra Files. These victims didn't just lose their minds, they lost their very selves, melting away in the dark of Sublevel 7. When the physical limits were reached, Gottlieb turned to the unseen. He spent millions on parapsychology, trying to find psychic spies among the broken subjects of Sublevel 7. They would put people into sensory deprivation and ask them to see across the ocean to read files in the Kremlin. They called it Project Stargate, but the foundation was laid here. In the agony of MKUltra, they believed that if you pushed a mind far enough past the point of pain, it would eventually snap into another dimension. The archives of these void sessions speak of voices that didn't belong to the humans, but to the mountain itself. What happened to the subjects when the experiments were over? They were moved to the used-up ward, a section of sublevel 7 where the lights were never turned on. These were the zombies of MKUltra, men and women who had no memory, no name, and no will left. They were kept alive only to ensure that the silent data was complete. The guard spoke of hearing them chanting in the dark, repetitive strings of numbers and names, the residue of the commands Gottlieb had implanted in their brains. They weren't patients, they were echoes, and this silent decision was to keep them buried until the state found a way to discard the evidence. Even the specialists weren't safe from the darkness of sublevel 7. Many of the young doctors who worked under Gottlieb eventually lost their own minds. They started seeing the same shadows their patients described, hearing the same whispers in the static. The environment of the sublevel was so toxic, so violation of nature, that it began to infect the observers themselves. Several specialists committed suicide within a year of joining the project, their final notes often mentioning a mouth that won't stop screaming. The silent decision was to treat these deaths as training accidents, keeping the poisoner's secrets, even from his own team. When the order to burn the files came in 1973, the physical evidence of sublevel 7 had to be erased too. Specialized teams arrived with industrial chemicals and heavy equipment. They didn't just clean the rooms, they stripped the walls to the bare concrete. Every electrode, every isolation tube, every human battery was dismantled and shipped to an undisclosed location in the desert. They wanted to make it look like the floor had never existed. But you can't scrub the energy from the rock. The silent decision to delete the past only made the ghosts of sublevel 7 more restless. Today, that military hospital is an apartment complex or a shopping mall. People walk over the ground every day, unaware of the screams that are still vibrating in the foundation. But the archives of the forbidden science, they aren't fully gone. They are in the static of your phone, in the patterns of your digital surveillance, and in the silent decisions being made today by men in clean suits. The laboratory has just moved into our pockets. Prepare yourself, for in the next chapter, we uncover the survivors and the sealed truth that even the CIA couldn't burn. Gottlieb's silent decision didn't just stay in the basements of military hospitals. It crawled into the halls of the world's most prestigious universities. At Harvard, in 1959, a young 16-year-old mathematics prodigy walked into a room, thinking he was part of a psychological study. He didn't know that the man across from him, Dr. Henry Murray, was being funded by the CIA's technical services staff. They weren't looking for math skills. They were looking for a way to weaponize human intellect. The air in that lab was thick with the smell of old books and the cold, surgical intent of MKUltra. The experiment was a psychological meat grinder. The young student, Ted Kaczynski, was forced to write down his most intimate beliefs and philosophy. Then, he was strapped into a chair with electrodes attached to his body, while a team of specialists attacked every single belief he held. They humiliated him, mocked him, and used high-intensity stress to see if they could shatter his core identity. The silent decision was to see if a brilliant mind could be turned into a vacuum, ready to be filled with whatever the state desired. But they didn't realize that when you break a genius, you don't always get a puppet. Sometimes you get a monster. Ted Kaczynski was never the same after those sessions. The archives of his life show a man who slowly retreated from society, moving into a tiny, wooden shack in the wilderness of Montana. The silent war inside his head had finally overflowed into the real world. He began an 18-year campaign of terror, sending bombs to the very institutions that he believed had destroyed his soul. They called him the Unabomber, but the FBI files don't mention that the blueprint for his rage was drafted in a CIA-funded lab at Harvard. He was the first great failure of the silent decision, and he would not be the last. In a federal prison in Atlanta, another MKUltra subject was being prepped for the abyss. Whitey Bulger, who would later become the most feared mobster in Boston, was given LSD over 50 times in a single year. He was told he was helping to find a cure for schizophrenia, but he was actually part of Gottlieb's truth serum trials. Bulger reported seeing the walls of his cell melting and hearing voices that whispered of blood and power. The silent decision to give a violent criminal the keys to his own subconscious essentially trained the most dangerous gangster in American history. The CIA didn't just study him, they armed his mind. But MKUltra didn't just create killers, it created entire movements. Ken Kesey, the author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was a volunteer for MKUltra LSD tests at Stanford. While the CIA was looking for mind control, Kesey found a new religion. He took the drugs and this silent decision back to the youth of America, launching the psychedelic revolution of the 1960s. The irony is terrifying. The government's attempt to control the mind ended up destabilizing an entire generation. The forbidden science had escaped the lab, and it was now being served in the coffee shops of San Francisco.
Then there are the claims that the CIA denies, but the archives suggest might be real. Kathy O'Brien, a survivor who claims to have been part of a sub-project called Monarch Programming, describes being used as a high-level courier through trauma-based mind control. She speaks of being forced into dissociative states, where she would perform tasks and then have her memory wiped by a specific trigger word. The silent decision was to treat her as a conspiracy theorist, a crazy witness, but her descriptions of the sublevels and the poisoners' methods matched the redacted files too perfectly to be ignored. How many sleepers are still among us? MKUltra specialists didn't just test drugs, they tested the ability to bury a personality under a silent trigger. They wanted to know if you could take a normal man and turn him into a Manchurian candidate. A person who would walk into a crowded room, perform an act of violence, and then, poof, return to their normal self with no memory of what they had done. The archives indicate that thousands of people were conditioned this way, and then released back into society. The silent decision to leave these human time bombs in our streets is the ultimate secret of the silent war archives. For every famous survivor, there were thousands of unknown victims who simply became ghosts. Men and women who wandered into military hospitals for a checkup, and left with their minds permanently fractured. They spent the rest of their lives in and out of institutions, hearing voices that were actually silent commands that had gone wrong. Their families were told they had mental breakdowns, but the archives show that they were actually the biological residue of MKUltra. The silent decision was to never provide them with medical care, to never admit they existed, so that the poisoner could keep his metal. Why did nobody go to prison? In the 1980s, when the survivors tried to sue the CIA, the government used the silent defense of national security. They claimed that revealing the details of the experiments would compromise the safety of the nation. They used the statute of limitations to protect the specialists, while the victims were dying of brain cancer and psychological trauma. The silent decision was to outweight the survivors, to let time burn the living archives, just as they had burned the paper ones in 1973. The justice system didn't save them, it helped to erase them. As we close this chapter, look at the world around you. The silent war didn't end in Montana or Atlanta, it just went digital. The techniques Gottlieb developed to break Ted Kaczynski are now being used in the algorithms of your social media. They are trying to find your triggers, to find your obedience button, and you are providing the data every single day. The laboratory has moved from Harvard to your pocket. Prepare yourself, for in the final chapter, we uncover the sealed truth and the final message that the poisoner left behind.
Richard Helms thought the fire had won. He believed that by burning the MKUltra Files in 1973, this silent decision was absolute. But he forgot about the paperwork of the abyss. In 1977, a researcher found a single box, mislabeled in a CIA financial archive. It wasn't operational files, it was financial receipts. Over 20,000 pages of proof. Every bottle of LSD, every electrode, every human battery. It was all paid for with taxpayers' money. The archives, they didn't burn, they just hid. And what they revealed was a nightmare that no government could ever fully explain away. In 1995, the world finally received an official apology. The president stood before the cameras and admitted that the government had violated the trust of the people. But the apology was hollow. It was a silent decision to give the public just enough truth to stop them from digging deeper. They admitted to the radiation tests, but they stayed silent on sublevel 7. They admitted to the LSD, but they never mentioned the RHIC frequency control. The archive was sanitized, turning a mass violation of human souls into a mere ethical oversight. MKUltra wasn't the beginning, and it wasn't the end. Before it was Project Artichoke, and after it, the Silent War simply changed its name. The techniques Gottlieb developed, the sensory deprivation, the de-patterning, they were just the prototype. The silent decision was to integrate mind control into the very infrastructure of our society. They realized that you don't need a lab. If you can control the information, we aren't subjects anymore. We are a data-driven herd. And the poisoner's ghost is now the algorithm. Look at the sensory tanks of the 21st century. They are in your palm. Every time you scroll, every time you like, you are providing the CIA's descendants with the very thing Gottlieb was looking for, your triggers. They don't need LSD to shatter your reality. They just need your news feed. This silent decision to weaponize the internet is MKUltra 2.0. It is a cognitive war, and the archives of your brain are being harvested every single millisecond. The lab has just moved from sublevel 7 into your subconscious. Wait, do you hear it now? That low, rhythmic pulse in the background of this video? It's not an audio error. It is a syncing tone, the same one used in the RHIC trials. By listening to this documentary, by opening the Silent War archives, you have officially become a secondary anchor. The frequency is infectious. Once you know the truth, your mind becomes a receiver. The silent decision to let this information leak was the ultimate trap. They want you to watch. They want you to fear, because fear is the electricity that keeps the archive alive. What happens when a society is used up? When we no longer trust our own eyes? We become like the Maryuta of Ping Fong, wooden logs waiting to be processed by the state. The silent decision to erode the truth has turned our world into a psychological hall of mirrors. We are wandering the streets of a digital Manchuria, hearing voices that we think are our own, but are actually silent commands from a dark room in Virginia. The archives are full, and we are the new pages. Is there a way out? Or is the observation loop permanent? The specialists say that once the seal is broken, it can never truly be closed. We have walked through the gallery of shadows, and the shadows, they have tasted our attention. Hitler's final secret, the Eldridge's phasing, and Gottlieb's mind control, they are all parts of the same great silent decision. They are building a world where the archive is us, and the silence, it is finally starting to scream our names.